Hi guys, this is a message from my daughter. She wanted to say hello to all of you. Now we're going to have our next lesson today. We are going to talk about circulatory shock. So yesterday where we left off, we were talking about hypertension and talking about risk factors associated with hypertension. Well, today we're going to talk about circulatory shock, and this is absolutely something that you would see in an emergency situation. So when we think about the cardiovascular system, we have to think about what the parts are, right? So you have your heart, you have your vessels, and then you have your blood, right? If any one of them is not performing up to snuff, an individual could experience circulatory shock. So I'm going to give you some examples of different types of shock and talk about some of the signs and symptoms associated with it. So first, let's talk about hypovolemia. Hypo for low, volemia for volume. This type of shock can occur when you have low blood or fluid volume. So we can kind of imagine situations where this would happen. So the thing that would probably be top of mind would be hemorrhaging, but also things like vomiting, diarrhea, or in the case of severe third-degree burns. Remember, in the dermis of the skin, quite a bit of fluid is contained within the dermis of the skin, and if someone had massive, widespread third-degree burns, they would lose a tremendous amount of fluid very, very quickly, and actually, hypovolemic shock is the first threat to life that really we would triage when we're thinking about a burn victim. Most people go right to infection, but infection would be a secondary issue after we've treated the shock, okay? So this would result from a very large scale loss of fluid. Second type of shock would be vascular shock. So this is a type of circulatory shock that's related directly to the vasculature, to your blood vessels. So if we think about what shock really is, where you've had inadequate circulation to your organs, this type of shock would result from vasodilation, where you had a system-wide dilation of all of the blood vessels and things that we've been talking about. Obviously, if you vasodilate everything all at once, this is going to result in a very quick drop in blood pressure. Okay, some of the things that can cause this type of vascular shock would be anaphylaxis, which you hear talked about very often in line with allergic reactions, failure of the autonomic nervous system to regulate vasodilation and vasoconstriction, or septic, when someone has sepsis and goes into septic shock, which is usually a result of bacterial infection. Okay, and we're going to come back to things like anaphylaxis when we talk about allergies, which we will cover when we do the immune system in a couple of weeks, okay? The last type of shock, way that we could have circulatory shock would be something like cardiogenic, which would simply be pump failure. So obviously this can occur during a heart attack or cardiac arrest, where if there's damage to the myocardium and the pump cannot pump adequately, if you can't pump adequately, you can't push fluid under the correct pressure to all of the organs. Some of the signs and symptoms that someone is in shock or entering shock would be things like, for example, if someone's in hypovolemic shock, some of the signs and symptoms you would think about would be thirst, dry mucous membranes. You would have a drop off in urine output. Okay, so initially someone's pulse would be quite robust because you would have compensatory contraction by the heart to allow for, to try to drive up some pressure. However, in the late stages of shock, the pulse would become thready because the heart cannot continually keep up that kind of compensatory work for a very long period of time. Okay. All right, so the last thing that we really need to talk, well, one other thing actually that I wanted to discuss was something that's called transient shock, which is just kind of interesting. So something like this can occur where this is a transient situation where a patient, perhaps a good example that I could give you for this is someone who's lying out in the sun. So when you're lying out in the sun, okay, all of the blood vessels, all those little blood vessels beneath your skin are going to dilate a little bit to let go of some heat because your body's getting warmer and warmer as you're laying out in the sun. So sometimes when you get up after being laying down in the sun or sitting for a long period of time because you've had this little kind of vasodilation situation going on within the entire dermis, that when someone gets up there in a state of almost transient shock where they have a drop off, a temporary drop off in their blood pressure, that would lead you to feel some lightheadedness, dizziness when you stood back up.